Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. Growing up in a tight-knit family, she was the eldest of 3 children. Known for her maturity and responsibility, Jessica quickly became the reliable figure in her family. She balanced academics and family obligations, showing a level of independence uncommon for her age. By the time she was a senior at Bullitt Central High School, Jessica was well regarded by her peers and teachers. With aspirations of becoming an accountant, she focused on her studies and planned to leave Shepherdsville for a future filled with promise. Her life seemed full of possibilities. Recently, she had bought a red Pontiac Sunfire, symbolizing her newfound independence. She had also started a relationship with a new boyfriend, adding another layer to her growing adulthood. However, on the morning of September 10, 1999, Jessica's life was cut short. She left for school as usual, but she never arrived. Hours later, Jessica's mother, Edna, came home around 1 p.m. to find Jessica's car parked in the driveway. Concerned, Edna noticed that Jessica's purse, keys, backpack, and cell phone were left inside the car. Something didn't seem right. Edna immediately called her husband, Michael, who confirmed Jessica hadn't shown up at school. After contacting the school, the worst fears were confirmed. Jessica had not attended that day. Despite initial assumptions that Jessica might have run away, the situation escalated quickly. The Dishon family reached out to local authorities, and the FBI soon became involved. What began as a missing persons case would evolve into a complex investigation over the coming years. Jessica's disappearance was met with skepticism by local law enforcement. While her parents were immediately concerned, most of the police force believed that Jessica had run away. This assumption slowed the investigation, as officers failed to treat the case with the urgency it warranted. Detective David Greenwell, a rookie at the time, was the only one who believed foul play was involved. He immediately began his investigation, focusing on Jessica's car, which had been found parked in the driveway with her belongings inside. However, the crime scene was quickly compromised. Police, family members, and even the public had access to the car and surrounding area, contaminating potential evidence. Despite these early setbacks, Greenwell remained convinced that Jessica had been abducted. Several leads pointed to Jessica's neighbor, David "Bucky" Brooks, who was seen burning clothes on the day of her disappearance. This strange behavior raised suspicions, and Greenwell's team searched Brooks' property, but they found no concrete evidence linking him to Jessica's disappearance. Brooks had also made conflicting statements. Initially, he claimed he had seen Jessica walking toward school, but later changed his story, saying he had been in bed all morning, a claim his wife later denied. The lack of cooperation from local law enforcement and the flawed investigation led the Dishon family to take matters into their own hands. They organized civilian search parties, hoping to find their daughter themselves. During one of these searches, Michael Dishon, Jessica's father, noticed that Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, was acting strangely. Stanley became visibly ill and vomited during the search, further raising suspicions. Despite these signs, the investigation remained stalled, with the community and family becoming increasingly frustrated with the police's lack of progress. 17 days after Jessica's disappearance, on September 27, 1999, her body was discovered in a remote area near the Salt River, just 7 miles from her home. The discovery was made by a bus driver named Karen Hobbs, who noticed something strange resting against a tree in a heavily wooded area. Upon calling 911, authorities quickly arrived and confirmed that the body was that of Jessica. However, the body had been so badly decomposed by this point that identifying her was initially difficult. The coroner's office later identified Jessica through her tattoo, class ring, and dental records. The body was found partially clothed, with evidence suggesting that it had been moved post-mortem. A rope, with traces of silver, red, and gray paint, was found around her leg, indicating that her body had been relocated after her death. The scene where her body was discovered was not one where she had likely died, leading investigators to believe she had been transported there. The body's condition indicated that she had been left in the woods for some time, which added to the difficulty of determining her exact cause of death. An autopsy confirmed that Jessica had suffered blunt force trauma to her face and was ultimately strangled. While some forensic evidence suggested that she may have been sexually assaulted, no conclusive proof of sexual assault was found. This discovery brought both a sense of closure and sorrow to Jessica's family. Although they now had confirmation that their daughter was no longer alive, the brutal nature of her death and the surrounding circumstances left them with more questions than answers. Suspicion now turned toward those close to her, especially her uncle, Stanley Dishon. The investigation into Jessica's death initially focused on David "Bucky" Brooks, her neighbor. His behavior raised significant red flags. On the day Jessica disappeared, Brooks was seen burning clothes, which drew immediate attention from investigators. When questioned, he first claimed he had seen Jessica walking toward school that morning. However, his story soon changed, with Brooks stating that he had been in bed all morning. His wife later contradicted this statement, claiming that Brooks had not been in bed at all. This inconsistency made him a prime suspect. Police conducted a search of Brooks' property, but they found no direct evidence linking him to Jessica's disappearance or death. However, they did find a pair of work gloves with an unusual odor, which raised further suspicions. Despite this, there was not enough physical evidence to make an arrest, and Brooks denied any involvement in Jessica's murder. As the investigation stagnated, the FBI was called in to assist with the case. The Bureau re-examined the evidence and began its own investigation into Jessica's disappearance and death. An $18,000 reward was posted for any information leading to the discovery of her killer. The FBI revisited the crime scene, including Jessica's car, which had been improperly handled by local law enforcement. A new examination revealed signs of a struggle near the driver's side door, supporting the theory that Jessica had been abducted. Despite the FBI's increased involvement and efforts to revisit the crime scene and evidence, there was still no definitive lead pointing to a clear suspect. While Bucky Brooks remained the primary suspect, there was insufficient evidence to charge him, and the investigation once again hit a dead end. In 2003, the case took a significant turn when the trial against David "Bucky" Brooks ended in a mistrial. This outcome occurred due to improper handling of the case, including the inadmissible use of polygraph test results during the trial. Despite the jury's suspicions, the case could not proceed due to legal issues, and the charges against Brooks were ultimately dropped. The mistrial was a crushing blow to Jessica's family, who had hoped for justice after years of searching for answers. With the case unresolved, they were left in a state of emotional limbo, unable to find closure. Jessica's disappearance and death became a forgotten case to many, and for 15 long years, the investigation remained cold. Over time, the trauma and unresolved grief took a toll on Jessica's parents, Edna and Michael. Their marriage, once strong, began to fall apart under the strain of the case. The pressure and emotional devastation of losing their daughter, coupled with the frustrations of seeing no justice, led to their eventual separation. While the community initially rallied around the Dishon family, offering support during the search for Jessica, the case's unresolved nature left many feeling abandoned. People began to move on, and the memory of Jessica's murder faded in the eyes of the public. As the years passed, hope seemed to dwindle, and the family, once so determined to find justice for Jessica, felt that they might never get the answers they desperately needed. The case remained unsolved, and for those involved, life moved on. But the pain of Jessica's loss lingered. In 2013, after years of frustration and unanswered questions, the case was unexpectedly reopened by Detective Lynn Hunt, who specialized in cold cases. Hunt quickly recognized how poorly the case had been handled from the beginning, noting the disorganized evidence and mishandling by the initial investigators. She decided to start from scratch, reviewing every detail. It was during this process that a crucial break occurred. An inmate came forward, claiming to have overheard a conversation regarding Jessica's murder. The inmate had information that only the killer would know, including details of Jessica's dismemberment and the movement of her body. This inmate's testimony provided shocking new details. He claimed that the killer had tortured Jessica and held her for days before ultimately killing her. These revelations were corroborated by another inmate who came forward, further strengthening the case against Jessica's uncle, Stanley Dishon. The inmate's descriptions matched key elements of the crime, such as the dismemberment of Jessica's body and the fact that her remains had been moved after death. The confessions from the inmates were startling, But they were more than just vague accusations. They provided precise information about the crime, such as how the killer had tried to conceal the murder and manipulate the scene to make it seem like a drug deal gone wrong. With this new information, authorities began to focus more on Stanley Dishon, who had been serving time for other serious crimes, including the sexual abuse of minors. Stanley, who had once maintained his innocence, was now implicated in Jessica's death. The details provided by the inmates about the crime were too specific to ignore. Detective Hunt, along with her team, began to piece together a case that would eventually lead to Stanley's arrest. Stanley Dishon's arrest brought a sense of relief to Jessica's family, but the path to justice was far from straightforward. Stanley, who had once been a trusted family member, was now accused of the brutal murder of his own niece. As authorities investigated further, they uncovered disturbing details about his past. Stanley had been sexually abusing Jessica for years, and on the morning of September 10, 1999, when she threatened to expose him to her new boyfriend, he decided to silence her forever. The morning of Jessica's disappearance began like any other. She left her house to go to school, driving her new red Pontiac, a symbol of her independence. However, she never made it to school. Stanley, who had been living with his brother Michael, Jessica's father, confronted her as she was about to leave. When Jessica refused to remain silent about the abuse, Stanley became enraged. He physically attacked her, knocking her down and breaking her jaw in the process. He then strangled her with a scarf, killing her in cold blood. That Stanley's actions didn't stop there. After murdering Jessica, he wrapped her body in her bedsheet, remade her bed to conceal any evidence of the struggle, and took her body to an abandoned barn. There, he held her for days, continuing to abuse and torture her before dismembering her body. He removed her fingers and part of her foot, likely in an attempt to prevent identification. When the time came, Stanley moved Jessica's remains to the woods near Salt River, where they would later be discovered. Despite mounting evidence, Stanley continued to deny any involvement in Jessica's death. He maintained his innocence throughout the investigation and even after his arrest. However, in a dramatic turn, Stanley took an Alford plea during his trial. This plea allowed him to avoid admitting guilt while acknowledging that the evidence against him was enough for a conviction. Although he refused to confess to the crime, the plea led to his conviction for manslaughter and other related crimes. At the sentencing, Jessica's parents gave emotional victim impact statements, expressing their anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. Michael, Jessica's father, broke down in court as he confronted his brother. He spoke of how he had opened his home to Stanley and given him a place to live, only for him to repay that kindness with unimaginable cruelty. Edna, Jessica's mother, also addressed the court, saying that her heart would never heal. They had lost their daughter, and with Stanley's actions, they had lost a family member as well. Stanley was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a sentence that Jessica's parents felt was too lenient considering the brutality of the crime. Though justice had been served, they struggled with the fact that their daughter's killer would eventually be released. Throughout the trial, Stanley's continued claims of innocence were met with disbelief by Jessica's family. They could not understand how he could maintain his lies after everything that had been revealed. Stanley Dishon's conviction brought a degree of closure, but for Jessica's family, the emotional toll was far from over. They were left to grapple with the painful reality that the person they had trusted most had been responsible for the most horrific crime imaginable. Stanley Dishon's conviction brought a semblance of closure to Jessica's family, but the damage was irreparable. The years of waiting, the emotional turmoil, and the false accusations that had surrounded the investigation had taken a heavy toll. Jessica's parents, Edna and Michael, had endured unimaginable grief since their daughter's disappearance in 1999, but the strain of the years-long investigation pushed them to their breaking point. Their marriage, once strong, ultimately crumbled under the weight of their loss. The case's unresolved nature had made it difficult for them to maintain a bond, as the absence of justice had caused insurmountable emotional distress. The case also profoundly affected the local community of Shepherdsville. Initially, the town had rallied around the Dishon family, offering support during their search for Jessica. As the investigation dragged on, however, many people began to grow weary. The case's lack of resolution made it feel as though the town had lost its sense of justice. While the Dishons were searching for their daughter, Many members of the community had hoped that law enforcement would be able to solve the case quickly, but the mishandling of evidence and the shifting focus of the investigation created a situation where the family felt abandoned. The community's pain didn't stop with Jessica's family. The false accusations against David "Bucky" Brooks weighed heavily on him, as he spent years being suspected of a crime he did not commit. He was a product of poor police work, and his life was forever impacted by the public perception that he was involved in the crime. While he was eventually cleared, the stigma remained, and his health deteriorated. He died in 2021 from cardiac arrest, a tragic end to a life that had been unjustly affected by the investigation. Though justice was finally served with Stanley's conviction, it wasn't without its scars. Jessica's family had been torn apart by his actions, and the community had been left to rebuild after years of uncertainty. The case of Jessica Dishon, though concluded, left an indelible mark on everyone involved. For Jessica's parents, the loss of their daughter was something they would never overcome. The conviction of Stanley Dishon, though necessary, could never fully heal the wound that had been left in the wake of her death.